Hey, so I am Jeremy Elder, Senior Product Designer on the UX Foundation team, for those of you who don't know me. And today I'm going to talk about buttons, which has got a lot of stigma around it and a lot of conversation. It's pretty interesting, really. And in particular, I want to talk about changes we've made to buttons in GitLab, the reasoning behind those changes, and where we're headed next. So feel free to jump in if you have any questions, and we'll cover those as we can. So after roughly like 20 years of working on UI design, I've talked about buttons probably more this year and fussed over more this year than any other. And last year, I don't think it was just like a 2020 thing, but it was just it was a hot topic. And to be honest, I couldn't even do my job without buttons, right? So they're important. They're critical. They're critical to our product, and they're so elemental, but it seems like that we should have moved beyond talking about them at some point, but we really haven't. And in thinking about this, I think there's good reason for it. And the reason this is even a topic in the first place is because there's so many issues in GitLab that come up about buttons and a variety of those topics. And I think there's good reason for talking about them. But first, I wanted to jump in just a quick history on the button. And feel free to leave a comment or follow up later if you have further insight into this. But as far as I can tell, buttons were really introduced as input type buttons. So for forms and to help submit forms. And the button element itself wasn't introduced until HTML 4.0. So I just want to read it quick from the spec itself. It says that visual user agents may render the button with relief of an up and down motion when clicked, which is where we get the bevel affordance that we see today. And they were created, quote, to offer richer rendering possibilities, end quote, namely that the element could have content. And so once that happened, it opened up the door for buttons to have images in them, to have iconography, to be styled in certain ways, and to be used elsewhere, to have links be styled like buttons. There's a lot of things that this opened up. And so because of that, we end up with buttons that can do and look like just about anything, and that can be problematic. So why do I think buttons are such a conversation piece? And I think what I alluded to, I think it's because they can do so many things. And they have infinite styling capabilities. So because of that, it's just kind of a limitless thing. And if we look at their namesake, in a non-digital sense, buttons can do everything from like securing your pants to like heating up a burrito in the microwave. And they could probably do both, which would be awesome. But if we want to really consider the original spec, they definitely offer richer rendering possibilities, right? And it's these possibilities that keep us talking and produce things that we need to address in the product. So let's talk specifically about GitLab buttons. As we've been maturing our design system, there's two talking points that we've recently addressed with the Foundations team, the wider UX team, and that we've documented in Pajamas. The first is defining and documenting button order and alignment. And the second is addressing button color as it relates to meaning and accessibility and consideration for color and some of those other attributes in the product itself. But before I want to unpack those, I want to mention how important it is that we consider them, those attributes of alignment and color in regards to other attributes. Because as I started to explore this and think about buttons, like why do they keep coming up? And you look at a button and it's such an elemental UI element, but really wrapped up in that are threads of the story about how we think about nearly everything else in our design system, right? So it's like buttons have like all the system. And what I mean by that is that, anything that we work on with buttons in isolation is a bad idea. And we need to consider the rest of the system. So if we take a look at a button, for example, if we just look at these attributes, you can see how many things a button touches, right? It's alignment, affordance, order, typography, placement, color, size, accessibility, voice and tone, behavior. Wrapped up in a button are all of these things. And so because of that, we can't just address one aspect of it without downstream or upstream impacts of others. And so that means that, for consideration like things in color, we should we should be thinking about how those are used elsewhere in the product. So the first item that I mentioned was button order and alignment. And really, I'll jump into some of those issues, but this has come up several times, and there's like lengthy conversation. And the purpose for tackling this problem was because it's been a topic that's come up for roughly 3 years, if not more. Some issues resolved, some not, some things addressed, some not. And the other part of this purpose was to make sure that we updated Pajama's documentation with clear examples of where we're landing on for decisions, so that we can effectively move forward. Some of the challenges that we faced was that there's many perspectives, and as I alluded to, historical conversations that we had to sort through. There was many of these, and it took some time, especially searching back over years of issues. Another challenge is just to consider what consistency looks like. And there's multiple levels of consistency, and it was kind of unpacked in some of the conversation and discussion. So you have industry conventions where there's consistency and alignment from an industry standpoint. There's consistency within the product itself. There's consistency within templates and workflows, and then finally consistency at a component level. And so it wasn't just that we could say we got to be consistent. We had to take a look at how to be consistent at these different levels, and align consistency in best practice with user expectations, and work through that. So some of the decisions that were out of this as a result was that buttons are left aligned in page content and forms, where content is typically unconstrained other than by a grid layout. So if you can think of just a regular page flow or a form, you're reading in an F pattern, left aligned buttons. And the other decision was buttons are right aligned in constrained containers like modals, dialogues, flows that continue in a progressive direction, as well as actions with a global impact and toolbars. It's a way to offset some of our content where if you have a left flow, maybe you have a toolbar that is right aligned that impacts that flow. So you're essentially stepping out of that flow. You have actions that can take you and back into that flow and address that flow. So thinking through some of those things, those are the rough, not rough, but high level decisions. And I'll go into a little more of that. So results, jump over here to Pajamas. I'm going to scroll all the way down. Okay, alignment and order. This is a new updated section that, as a result of the work that we did here, where we now document alignment and we provide visual examples. So in this, you can see kind of what I just read about the alignment. I won't go through all of this, but I want to show as a result, we do now have high-level documentation for different alignment types. We address right to left languages and some of the accessibility reasons for this, some of the reading patterns that are expected, and how we might employ those to think consistently about placement. So we have visuals, just scroll, and examples. Center alignment is also another thing for empty states or promotional content where there might be only single actions in the context, etc. We talk about order, so right to left, and how order is employed when you have different alignment, right to left languages. So covering lots of stuff. There's code examples, etc. So I encourage you to take a look through that. I just wanted to pop over here real quick and show. Here's the KR that we were working through for the alignment and whatnot. Here's the issue, and I'm just scrolling just to not make you sick, but just to give you a sense of the depth of conversation. This is just in one issue. There's quite a bit, and we did have community contribution and input, which was really helpful. And as you can see, if I get back up here, tons of issues related to this. And so, it's a hot topic, and it was definitely something worth diving in and covering. And so learning the next steps from this effort, it depends is an acceptable conclusion so long as what it depends on is documented. And that's one of those things where alignment is, you can kind of have that answer of like, well, it depends. But we wanted to make sure that we went a step beyond that and identified what it depends on and get it documented. And then Another learning is it's crucial to consider what consistency looks like at different levels of the experience and different levels of the UI. So we're using heuristics and user expectations as they come into the product, but then considering, okay, what's the consistency with a modal? Is it different than a page might be? What's the goal of the buttons here? Where's somebody looking to expect the actions being placed? So it was one of those opportunities to look at consistency kind of in a different light and understand that there's different levels of it. And then lastly, as a next step, the top 40 most visited pages in GitLab are being audited and updated based on this decision and documentation. So we're going through the top 40, taking a look at alignment, taking a look at button order, and adjusting where needed. So I'll jump over to the second goal, which was to address button color, meaning, and accessibility. And this come up, it's come up in many forms as far as what color of button should I use? Should I use success, or does this constitute a warning? Is this destructive enough where it needs danger? All of those types of conversations. And then as another part of that, the accessibility of button color, where orange-green buttons together have issues with color blindness. And so we wanted to make sure that was addressed. So the purpose, as I mentioned, was just to explore the use of coloring buttons as it relates to the meaning and accessibility. And we wanted to avoid design decision conflicts where primary action and color don't agree. A good example of that was our alerts, where they were themed, right? You have a danger alert, the buttons are red because it's a danger, the background's red, but it might be a positive action within that alert that alleviates the danger, right? So it's a warning, but the action is actually positive, not a danger warning. You're not clicking on a destructive action in the danger. And so those were conflicting, and we wanted to prevent things like that coming up. Another purpose was to explore the use of color in the entire UI to understand how buttons fit. We did some research around that. And lastly, allow color in the UI to have more value by using less of this. So it's part of beautifying the UI and considering all the different things that employ color. We wanted to see if we could increase the value by effectively using less of it and having buttons as kind of a good starting point. Wanted to share this insight from Pedro. Thank you, Pedro, for this. He added this to one of the issues that's linked. And I found it extremely helpful as I was navigating some research and just trying to kind of understand it and wrap my mind around it. And I'm going to read this whole thing because I find it extremely valuable. Pedro says, when looking at the whole UI, we have elements where color plays a much more important role than buttons, and where it's difficult to provide a good experience without color. Some examples: identifying added and remove lines and diffs, identifying confidential issues, calling out alerts that have a warning or danger meaning, and more. And lastly, he says, and buttons are used consciously, where the user makes a conscious decision to use the button. They're looking to make an action, right? Whereas other UI elements are used and apprehended unconsciously with no opt-in from the user, like text, badges, icons, and others. I think this is just just brilliant. Insert that mind exploding emoji. It's one of those things where it makes a lot of sense. People look for buttons. They're looking to perform an action. If they're looking for it and we employ correct placement and affordance, people are going to find that action. But there's other things that they're not going to find as readily, like things that have been removed in a diff or added in a diff, or confidentiality, etc. So I thought that was very helpful. Some of the challenges we faced: preference and perception can conflict, and just unpack that a little bit. In some of our user testing, people preferred more colors. However, people perceived that a product might be more quality if there were less colors. So here we're kind of in the mix of, we want to beautify the UI. We want to have a professional looking product. So in that case, perception would say, hey, yeah, less colors, it's cleaner, it's more like this OS or that OS. However, all people like color, right? So there was some interesting challenges between the conflict there. Another challenge was mixed research results, often between users, but also users contradicting themselves. So you might ask them one question about what do you prefer here as far as use of color? there's many colors. I want all the colors. And then later, if you had a UI, would you prefer to use 1 to 2 colors or 3 to 5? And sometimes they'd say 1 to 2. So it completely conflicted with or contradicted themselves from earlier answers. So it's really interesting to sort through that and work through the challenge of kind of unraveling why that might be, and how to ask better questions as well. We did a few rounds of testing to help increase the fidelity. Another challenge is that adding to the design system is much easier than taking away. As design systems get built up, there's momentum, you're adding things that people can use, but at some point you get to this where the tide has come in and now it's time to go back out, and there's this receding effect that needs to happen where you decide, hey, this is too much here and we really need to pull this back, or maybe we don't need all these variants, etc. And doing that is a lot harder than adding. So that's a challenge. And lastly, it's easier said than done. The scope of implementing a change like this is huge, and we've uncovered that with, let's see here, where we have Haml and Ruby templates, for example, that we can't just go and update a view component and have everything propagate. We have to go in and manually do them one at a time. And we're working on some other efforts to help kind of soften that effort and make it easier. So a few insights from research. I'll go through these quickly, but color is a visual indicator of an action, but the label and the icon and the affordance and placement were more important. So while color played a role, I would say that a majority of users relied mostly on the action itself. What does the icon mean? What is the label saying? Does it align with what they're intending to do? Page layout and complexity can impact button performance just as much as the appearance and placement of the button itself. Appearance including color. So if we have a very complex layout, that's going to impact the fidelity of the button, just as much or sometimes more than the button color itself. Websites with too many colors can appear unprofessional, unintuitive, or amateurish, as one respondent added. People preferred more colors, but reducing the colors didn't impact finding actions. This was something that Tori had really good insight on, that as she was going through some of our research and reviewing it, that even though people were saying, hey, I prefer more colors here, when we're asking questions about, can you find this? Where would you go to do this? There was no impact when we reduced color. So that was really critical insight. And lastly, blue is valid as the main color for actions like links and buttons, etc. And so based on that last insight decision, blue is the main action for color since it has a more universal consistency and is commonly identified with actions in a digital context. This goes back to normal heuristics and what people are expecting, not only with operating systems, but also within websites. Blue is links. A lot of people associate that with actions. Another decision based on that, well, using blue also meant that red-green color blindness isn't a factor with button combinations anymore. So we're eliminating that variable where now you can't have a danger button and a success button together, or a warning button and a success button together, where a user can't tell the difference other than the label itself. This decision helps eliminate that. And I did want to mention that green and purple were considerations, but ultimately weren't as universal. Green has a bend towards success, and that's not always what we want to convey. And then purple had some limitations with not only accessibility and vibrance, but also just how we theme in the product and being able to separate the GitLab brand from functionality within the product. And then thinking through, like, okay, if there's a brand change later, does that mean that all of the purple buttons have to change now? And so there was just more downstream impact to that. And then purple just doesn't have like as universal of a meaning as blue did. Another decision was to reduce the number of button variants by deprecating the orange warning button and the green success button. So along with that, we're removing all the primary, secondary, tertiary variants of those. So we're getting some performance benefits, ideally. And then lastly, the blue confirm button, which is what we now call our main default button. It's the confirm button, meaning that a user is confirming their action, and it can be a positive action, a negative action, a neutral action, but that's a confirmation of what they were intending to do. That variant's added, and it takes on the info button's properties, and then the actual info naming will be deprecated, and we're working through a lot of that right now. So some of the results from this, jump back over to pajamas. And if you go through there, you'll see that we have the confirm and danger button. We have simplified our variants, simplified the options so that we don't have just a plethora of variants to choose from. We now have 3 main ones that we can leverage, and all the other buttons and whatnot are based off of that. So sorry for all the wordiness here, but some benefits: no more orange-green button confusion for colorblind users. I think that's huge, and I think it'll provide us with great opportunities down the road to have combinations that are not conflicting. Second, the color of actions aligns throughout the product. They're always blue, red, or neutral. And this aligns with text links, with toggles, with pagination, checkboxes, radio buttons. So there's other UI elements, like I mentioned earlier, that we were considering. If we were to have green or purple buttons that are actions, well, what happens to a blue toggle? Should that stay blue? If we have blue pagination or browser default checkboxes, radio buttons that use blue, should those change? So using blue helps us to align more consistently with actions throughout the product. Another benefit is easier design decisions. So focusing more on the level of the action and not the meaning of the action, which is often contextual. So from a design standpoint, we can look at, is this primary, secondary, is this tertiary? What is the order, the hierarchy? And we don't have to worry as much about the meaning of the action. So is this positive? Is it negative? And is it primary, secondary? It added a whole nother layer to that decision tree that we can now hopefully eliminate. To be determined benefits. These are ones that we'll test out, and they'll kind of bear out over time as we do more auditing and migrating and updating. But hopefully we have less confusion between buttons and badges or labels. A reduction in color in buttons means that there's not going to be orange and green buttons that might conflict with warning badges or labels that have those properties. So that can be helpful. Hopefully an increased perception that GitLab is a professional and polished product. We have a page that has 5 different button colors on it. Now it has maybe 2 or 3. I think that can add a lot of value and make it seem a lot more thought through and concise. And then lastly, just more focus internally on what the button actually says than what it looks like. And this goes back to that insight that what the label or what the action is was more important than how the button looked. And so if we can focus more on keying in on those actions and making sure that that verbiage aligns with a user's intent, I think we'll be better for it. Lastly, learning and next steps. We learned that some UI elements rely on and impact global aspects more than we realize. And I definitely, that was kind of a paradigm shift for me as I was looking through the buttons again, just understanding how much of the button relied on other aspects and how much if we changed it here, it would impact other aspects from a design system standpoint. Learned that testing sometimes something as nuanced and prolific as color is challenging. People perceive color differently. Color means something differently to them based on locality. It means something to them differently based on their operating system. So there's a challenge in testing that and a great deal of preference around that. Next step, future exploration will address areas that still aren't clear. So there's areas that we uncovered in research, like visual weight and color of secondary actions, overall scannability. Those are things that we want to test more on to help identify. And that also has to do with larger efforts around page layout and placement of buttons. And also related to the previous effort about button order alignment, the top 40 pages are being audited and updated by these decisions. So we're looking at how do we employ the confirm button? When does it make sense? How do, what level of primary, secondary should be used? So, excuse me, that's one area that we're going to be working on. Okay, that was a lot. So thanks, massive thanks. I definitely want to thank everyone who participated in the conversation, and those who reviewed the documentation, reviewed the input. There was some absolutely fantastic conversation and discussion in there. And I want to say too that this is not like the end of the story, right? We made a decision, here we are, let's iterate and keep moving forward. So if anything here kind of strikes you as like, I'm not sure about that, or that's really interesting, or how might we, I'd love to pick up those conversations and continue to move this forward. And obviously, thanks for taking the time to listen to me talk about buttons.
Mike, do you want to vocalize some of your questions and comments?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, you covered so much ground, like my mind was just buzzing with ideas. But these are some of the things that I felt like I could ask and not derail everything. Really great presentation. So if I understand the needs of people with anxiety and Asperger's, reducing number of colors would actually make the product better for them. Am I understanding that accessibility guideline?
That's a really interesting question. Trying to think how to answer this. I think that it wouldn't necessarily be a requirement. However, the reduction of colors could be a benefit for somebody that might be distracted by the number of colors, or that those types of patterns could be confusing. So I think there is a benefit to that. I will say one of the things that we've wanted to test more is with users that experience disabilities. However, it's very challenging just because of privacy laws and whatnot. So this is something that I would love to test more. And we're still navigating that to try to figure out how to do so in a way that that is acceptable and beneficial for both parties. But I'm rambling a bit, but I do think there's a benefit to it. However, we don't have like concrete data to support that. And it's also not something that's mentioned much in like an accessibility spec or requirement.
Yeah, one reason I ask is I wonder if we already had accessibility personas, and when we make design decisions, we filter those decisions through those personas, that we may not, and this goes back to Jarek's mention of accessibility rot, I think. If we were to follow those guidelines in the first place, we wouldn't have all these colors and have to go through all the work to remove them, because we'd already have this constraint that, hey, for Benny, we can't have this many colors, or we can't add this color because it's going to degrade the experience for, what is it, like 10% of the population probably has some kind of anxiety or learning difference type of thing. So yeah, my next question was more general accessibility. It wasn't about buttons or colors specifically, but I'm wondering if we've explored having accessibility personas documented somewhere, like on the category page for the accessibility merge request widget, or accessibility personas in GitLab UI or pajamas, if that's ever come up, and if that would be interesting to do.
I think it's come up, and that course has some really good insight on that. I personally haven't explored it too deep as far as making it an action item. To be quite honest, I've looked at more the technical side of thing, like how might a keyboard user, or how might screen reader user approach these things. So not necessarily wrapping the persona around it, but more the functionality of how somebody might access things. But I think that blending the two would really emphasize what Jarrett talked about as far as empathy, and I think that would be beneficial to explore.
Cool, thanks.
I think I have the next one. And I'm sorry, I missed the last approximately 2 minutes of your presentation because I got sidetracked by something. So if you answered this already, I apologize in advance. This was a super great overview. I learned a ton from it. What are the action items coming out of this for designers? What do you need the rest of the team to do to help push this forward?
Let's see. Well, I'll kick a question back and then I'll answer it. My question back to designers would be, what do you feel like you should be doing now? And I'll just leave that like that. My answer would be to continue to participate in these things. If there's ways that you can help implement the changes and the decisions that we've made, that would be helpful. And just in the day-to-day work, to just to be thinking about these things, thinking about how color and alignment in a greater context makes things easier or more difficult for somebody to use. And the last thought is to think more about consistency in different ways, rather than just global consistency. Think about it at different layers, at industry standards, the product as a whole, and then component and workflow. If we start to think about consistency in those ways, I think some of those conflicts of, well, modals are right aligned, but in this workflow, the button's left, like maybe those aren't conflicting because there's consistency that happens in a different way. So I would think thinking through that would be helpful. But based on my question, does anybody have any concrete things that they would feel like, oh, this is what I should be doing now? And if not, that's okay too.
I have two things. One is read the new button docs. If you haven't read them, read them. And two is start using those new guidelines in all of your designs going forward. So any design you're touching, we're making sure to use those new guidelines.
That's why I asked. So what I don't want anyone to walk away from this presentation with is the idea that, like, oh, problem solved. Somebody else got it covered. I'm good. I'm going to go about my daily business. No, this is every single person on the team has to help to make sure that we are driving this forward. You all play a role in this. It's a part of every decision that you make in your designs. So I just want to make sure, like, to call that out specifically is, this is all of us. You got to understand this stuff. You have to internalize it. It has to become a part of how you work.
Yeah, and even though we're working on the top 40 pages, we have way more than 40 pages. So there's going to be pages in your stage group that we're not going to see or touch. So if you do have deprecated buttons in there, see if you can fit it in to your milestone. It might just be a simple change, might be a little more complex, but if we all help in the effort on this, I think it just overall create a more consistent experience.
Yeah, I wanted to share my example when I was just working recently on the merge widget redesign, and Jeremy also left some great comments there in Figma. And when I was designing it, it was just very easy. I didn't even have to think about which variant to use because I went into Figma, I was looking at the buttons and it had confirm, danger, default. And I was like, okay, yeah, confirm. So I didn't even go and look for the success one. So for the merge button, I'm already planning to change that button to use the confirm variant. And I actually received positive feedback from developers saying, hey, as a user, this looks much better. It kind of pops much more than the green success one. I don't know why you changed it, but it looks great. So they're not even aware that this is a thing now, and they're giving positive feedback because of that as a user. So yeah, I really appreciate the work being done here and how easy it is. And also the organization in Figma, as I said, I just went in and saw those variants. It still has a deprecated variants, which I think it's good, but it's a no-brainer, I guess. So that's what I'm doing now, is just using it as the default, as the single source of truth.
Any other questions or comments for Jeremy? Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Jeremy, for going over this overview. And I'm super excited to see all the deprecated components or buttons and components be removed from GitLab over time. So awesome.